That story you've been told about Pappy Van Winkle, that demand crushed supply, and that's the whole reason no civilian can find a bottle, falls apart the second you look at how the allocations actually move through the system. The problem was never the juice running out. The problem is who decides where it lands before it ever hits a shelf you're allowed to walk up to. Sazerac's Buffalo Trace makes the whiskey. The yearly drop is small, but not microscopic. And somewhere between the loading dock and your local liquor store, the bottle stops being a product and starts being a favor. That's where the trail goes cold for the rest of us. By the end of this, I'll show you which honest wheated bourbons drink shockingly close to Pappy for under $30, and the bottle most enthusiasts agree is the closest legal substitute on the planet. Here's the setup nobody on the manufacturer side wants spelled out plainly. Pappy is real whiskey, made by real people, but the scarcity story you've been sold is a marketing miracle dressed up as a supply problem. Once you understand the distribution mechanics, the whole hunt looks different. You stop blaming the bourbon boom. You start looking at the structural decisions that turned a nice wheated bourbon into a status object that very few human beings have ever poured into an actual glass. A quick word on what this script is and isn't. I'm not telling you Pappy is bad whiskey. The Van Winkle family has a real, multi-generational connection to wheated bourbon that predates any of this hysteria, and the partnership with Buffalo Trace, dating to roughly 2002, brought back a style of bourbon that had been quietly fading. The juice has integrity. The brand has history. What I'm telling you is that the system around the bottle has metastasized into something that has very little to do with whiskey at all. Let's start with the convenient narrative, because it's the version repeated everywhere. The official line goes like this: wheated bourbon takes a long time to make. Pappy is aged anywhere from 10 to 23 years. 2 decades ago, when the current Pappy stocks were laid down, almost nobody wanted slow-aged wheated bourbon, so very little was distilled. Then the bourbon boom hit, demand exploded, and now we're all paying the price for a category nobody saw coming. It's a tidy story. The distilleries shrug, the distributors shrug, the retailers shrug, and you, the drinker, accept that it's just math. The math supposedly says no. But here's where the convenient narrative starts to crack. Industry observers describe an annual Van Winkle release that, while genuinely small by Buffalo Trace's overall output, still amounts to thousands upon thousands of bottles every fall, across the full lineup of Lot B, Family Reserve, and the various Pappy expressions. That's not a handful. That's not a single barrel. The yield is small. In the bourbon world, sure, but it's not so small that an entire country of curious drinkers should never see one at retail. So if production isn't microscopic, where does it all go? That's the question the demand story refuses to answer. And once you start tracing the actual path a single bottle takes from the rickhouse to the consumer, the picture stops looking like a supply shortage and starts looking like something else entirely. A controlled flow, a hand-shaped bottleneck, a system where the lever isn't yield. The lever is allocation. Listen, that distinction matters, because shortage and allocation are not the same thing, even though the marketplace treats them as if they were. Now, consider what happens after Buffalo Trace fills, labels, and palletizes the annual Van Winkle release. The whiskey doesn't go to stores. It goes, by law in most American states, through a 3-tier system. The producer sells to a state-licensed distributor. The distributor sells to retailers. The retailer sells to you. Each state has its own distributor, sometimes more than one, and each distributor is sitting on a tiny pool. A couple of cases here, a couple of cases there. A state with 2,000 licensed liquor retailers might receive 40 bottles of Family Reserve total. 40. Spread across 2,000 stores. The shortage isn't national, it's surgical. And the 3-tier system, originally designed to prevent producer monopolies, ends up doing something almost ironic when applied to a hyper-allocated brand. Each state becomes its own little kingdom, with its own rules, its own favored accounts, its own retail relationships. So the consumer in Kentucky, the consumer in Texas, and the consumer in New York are not actually competing in the same market. They're competing in 50 separate markets, each with its own gatekeepers. And the rules in one don't translate to the rules in another. Try explaining that to someone who just wants a bottle for their dad's birthday. So the distributor has to decide who gets one. And this is where industry observers describe the system getting interesting. The decisions don't appear to follow a clean public formula. They follow relationships. Long-standing accounts that have moved a lot of Sazerac's broader portfolio, the Buffalo Trace, the Eagle Rare, the Weller, the Blantons, the Rye lineup, tend to receive the prestige allocations. It looks from the outside like a loyalty program with no public terms and no published rules. Nobody publishes the spreadsheet. Nobody has to. Think about that mechanic for a second. To even be in the conversation for a Pappy allocation as a retailer, you generally need to have been buying steadily, in volume, across the producer's broader catalog for years. The famous bottle becomes the carrot at the end of a long, quiet stick. From a business perspective, that's perfectly rational. From a consumer perspective, it means the queue forms long before the bottle arrives, and the queue isn't made of drinkers, it's made of accounts. Then, the bottles arrive at the favored retailers. And here's where the second filter happens. 6 bottles. 600 customers asking. Some shops run a raffle. Some shops save the bottles for a bourbon club, where membership requires spending heavily on lower-tier inventory. Some shops route bottles to restaurants and bars that already buy heavily from them, where the whiskey ends up as a $40 a pour menu item rather than a take-home bottle. And some shops appear to operate what longtime customers describe as backroom allocations. The bottle goes to whoever has been loyal, whoever has spent enough, whoever knows the owner. You, the drinker walking in cold off the street with cash in hand, were never in that conversation. The bottle was already accounted for before the truck arrived. It existed at retail for, in some cases, less than an hour. It may have never been on a shelf at all. So when you ask the cashier, and they shrug and say, "We don't get any," they're sometimes telling the truth, and sometimes saying the only thing they're allowed to say. Either way, you walk out empty. The system worked exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed for you. And there's a quieter layer underneath all of this. Industry observers describe a portion of the annual release that never enters general distribution at all. Bottles routed to on-site tasting rooms, to charity auctions, to brand ambassador programs, to private trade show pours, to gifted samples for journalists and contests. None of that is sinister on its face. But each carved-off slice is a slice that didn't go to a retailer, which means it didn't go to your local shop, which means it never had the chance to reach a regular drinker walking in with no inside connection. Now layer on the secondary market, because this is where the whole thing turns from frustrating into something almost surreal. A meaningful share of the bottles that do reach individual buyers never get opened. They get photographed, listed, flipped, and traded at multiples of MSRP. Sometimes 4 times, sometimes 10 times, sometimes more depending on the expression and the year. Family Reserve at 23 years has changed hands at prices that genuinely shock people who haven't followed the market. Industry observers note that a substantial fraction of every annual release effectively becomes financial product rather than beverage. It moves between collectors. It sits in display cabinets. It accrues value the way a watch does, or a sealed sneaker. So picture the full pipeline now. A small but not tiny annual production. A distributor tier that handpicks favored accounts. A retail tier that handpicks favored customers. A secondary market that absorbs bottles before they're opened. By the time the whiskey is poured into a glass, if it's poured at all, it has passed through 3 or 4 sets of gatekeepers, each of whom extracted either money, loyalty, or both. The drinker who actually wanted a glass of well-aged wheated bourbon was the last person consulted in the entire chain. And every step of that pipeline reinforces the next one. The thinner the retail allocation, the higher the secondary market price. The higher the secondary market price, the stronger the incentive for buyers to flip rather than open. The more flipping, the fewer bottles consumed. The fewer bottles consumed, the more mythical the brand becomes. The more mythical the brand becomes, the more incentive distributors and retailers have to keep the allocation tight. Because tightness is the entire mechanism that built the legend in the first place. It's a closed loop, a self-reinforcing scarcity engine. Here's the part that sticks with me. The whiskey itself, the liquid in the bottle, it's good. Genuinely good. Soft brown sugar, vanilla bean, a creamy mouthfeel that only wheated mash bills tend to produce. Gentle baking spice on the back end. Very little of the sharp rye bite that defines most bourbon. It's a beautiful pour. But here's the thing. It's not a magical, unrepeatable, once-in-a-lifetime liquid. It's wheated bourbon made by a distillery that also makes a lot of other wheated bourbon. The same yeast, the same mash bill philosophy, the same warehouses, the same hands. Because if you can't get the bottle, the question becomes, what drinks like the bottle? Number one in the lineup of honest substitutes, and the answer most enthusiasts arrive at, is W.L. Weller Antique 107. Sazerac, same producer, same wheated mash bill family. At 53.5% ABV, it pours with more heat than the standard Van Winkle releases, but the flavor architecture is unmistakably related. Brown butter, toasted pecan, a curl of warm cinnamon, that same soft cushion on the palate that only wheaters give you. In my assessment, when you can find Weller Antique 107 at its actual suggested price of around $25 to $30, it represents one of the most absurd value propositions in American whiskey. The catch, Weller itself is now allocated in many markets, partly because the bourbon community figured out the secret. But it's wildly easier to find than Pappy, and a fraction of the cost when you do. Weller 12 sits one tier up, 12 years old, 45% ABV, and probably the closest single bottle substitute for the entry-level Pappy expressions in terms of flavor profile. Caramelized stone fruit, a whisper of dried apricot, that wheated softness rounded by real age. The bottle, when honestly priced, lands somewhere around $40 to $50. The market has pushed it higher in many regions, sometimes embarrassingly higher, but the original MSRP tells you what the producer thinks the liquid is worth. That gap between MSRP and shelf price is itself a tell about how the wheated category is being managed. Old Weller Antique, the older labeling of Weller Antique 107, shows up on the secondary occasionally and drinks the same as its modern sibling. Same juice, same proof, different label era. If you stumble on a dusty bottle in an out-of-the-way shop, it's worth grabbing. Same flavor, no premium for the new dress. The label refresh changed the look, not the liquid, and that single fact tells you more about the spirits industry than most marketing campaigns ever will. Something has shifted in this category that almost nobody talks about clearly. As Pappy became impossible, drinkers migrated to Weller. As they migrated, Weller became allocated. The pricing drifted upward, sometimes dramatically, and a category that used to be a quiet bargain is now a tier of its own. The same allocation mechanics that built the Pappy myth are quietly being applied to its closest cousins. So the bargain window on Antique 107s and Weller 12 is narrower today than 5 years ago. You can still find them. You just have to look harder. Maker's Mark Cellar Aged is a more recent entry in the wheated conversation. Beam Suntory's Maker's Mark, finished with extended aging in cooler rickhouse zones to slow the wood's grip, and the result is a wheated bourbon with surprising depth. Dark honey, espresso crema, a long, warm finish that sits gently along the back of the palate. Around $150 at suggested retail, which is not cheap, but compared to what Pappy clears on the secondary, it's almost a bargain. And it actually makes it onto shelves. Larceny Barrel Proof, from Heaven Hill, takes a different wheated mash bill in a completely different direction. Higher proof, often above 60% ABV, batch released several times a year. Heavier, more aggressive, with toffee, char, and a hot cinnamon bark finish. It's not trying to be Pappy. It's trying to be the loudest wheated bourbon in the room. But for drinkers who like the wheated softness with real intensity behind it, Larceny Barrel Proof scratches the itch and, importantly, you can usually find it. $40 to $70, depending on batch and market. Heaven Hill, by the way, is one of the few large American distilleries still family-owned, and they've quietly become a reliable producer of wheated bourbon at honest prices. Their standard larceny, non-barrel proof, around 46% ABV, sits in the $25 range and pours warm vanilla, soft brown sugar, a little orange peel, and a finish that doesn't punish you. It's not a revelation in a glass. It is, however, an everyday weeder that lets a drinker actually drink wheated bourbon, which is the entire point most chasers seem to forget. Other wheated mash bill bourbons worth knowing: Rebel from Lux Row, the standard maker's mark and its cask strength sibling, the various Old Fitzgerald bottled in bond releases, from Heaven Hill, and when you can find it, Wyoming whiskey's wheated expressions out west. None of these are Pappy. All of them, in their honest moments, deliver the wheated experience the chase is supposedly about, for a fraction of the price, with none of the ritual humiliation of standing in a raffle line every November. Try this experiment if you're ever genuinely curious. Pour a glass of Weller Antique 107 and a glass of Weller 12 side by side. Sit with them for 10 minutes. Don't rush. Notice the way the wheated sweetness settles low on the tongue, rather than spiking on the front of the palate the way rye mash bourbons tend to. Notice the long, soft finish, that gentle warmth that lingers in the back of the throat without ever turning aggressive. That experience right there, in those 2 glasses on your kitchen counter, is the same fundamental experience the entire Pappy hunt is built around. Listen, I'll be straight with you. There are subtle differences. A 20-year-old wheated bourbon does have layers a 12-year-old doesn't. Long aging in new charred oak adds something. Call it depth. Call it integration. Call it patience translated into liquid form. I won't pretend Pappy 23 and Weller 12 are identical pours, but the question every drinker has to honestly answer is whether those subtle differences justify a price multiple of 20, 30, sometimes 50 times the cost of the substitute, and whether they justify spending a decade hunting for a chance to find out. There's also a quieter truth most people who've tasted Pappy alongside other wheated bourbons will admit. The very oldest expressions can sometimes be over-oaked. Long contact with charred staves, pushing flavor toward dry tannin, splintered wood, a bitterness on the finish that doesn't always reward the wait. Some bottles are sublime, some are tired. The brand mythology doesn't really account for batch-to-batch variation. So let me put this whole conversation back together. The reason you can't find Pappy Van Winkle is not, in any meaningful sense, that Sazerac doesn't make enough of it. The reason is that the supply is small to begin with, then strained through a 3-tier system that filters by relationship, then strained again at retail by another set of relationships. And then, a chunk of what's left disappears into a secondary market that treats the bottle as an asset rather than a beverage. The shortage you're feeling is engineered as much as it is natural. The hunt itself is a wrong target. You're not chasing whiskey. You're chasing a position in a queue you were never invited to join, hoping that this year, in this state, at this shop, the lottery ball drops on your number. You can spend a decade doing that. Some people have. Or you can take the same money, not even close to the same money honestly, a small fraction of it, and walk out with a bottle of Weller 12, a bottle of Larceny Barrel Proof, and a bottle of Maker's Cellar Aged, and pour all 3 side by side, and find out that the wheated bourbon experience was never locked behind a single label. It was just being dressed up to look that way. The next time someone tells you Pappy is impossible to find because of demand, you'll know the rest of the sentence. Demand only matters if supply is honestly distributed. The bottle isn't missing from the market, it's missing from your market. And the better wheated bourbons, the ones that actually want to be in your glass, have been sitting on shelves nearby the whole time, waiting for you to stop chasing the wrong target.